Hello and welcome to the Bill Douglas Cinema Museum podcast series on item histories. For this series, we'll be taking a look at items from the Bill Douglas Cinema Museum, which is located on the University of Exeter campus. We'll be taking items from the museum and providing context for them, discussing their history and their importance to the museum.
We are student interns Chloé and Jess. Hi, Jess.
Hi, Chloé.
And today we are joined by Professor Joe Kember. Hello. Joe's a professor in film and visual culture at the University of Exeter, specialising in silent cinema and early exhibition methods. Today we'll be discussing the silent film era and its impact on wider society. So, hi, Joe. Thank you for joining us. So let's get right into it. Firstly, could you please talk to us a little bit about your recent research into the exhibition of popular screen entertainment during the silent era?
Of course. So I'm a lecturer in film, but much of my research is really based on both film and all the things which preceded it. So that includes quite a wide range of media. I look at entertainments of all sorts, and they stretch from about 1800, actually, and a bit before, right the way through to, well, I put the number 1914, but I kind of stretch up to 1940. Actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's been quite an extensive period of research for me. So I'll give you a bit of context for it. I've been working on it with my colleague in English, who is Professor John Plunkett.
Oh, yeah.
And John works extensively on similar areas, a little bit earlier than I do. And that's meant that actually we sort of joined forces. He works on what's usually called Victorian studies, which includes all sorts of visual culture these days. And I work on later visual cultures. Between us, we've put together a sort of an exhibition history. And it's taken us a lot of time. It's taken us a good 10 years, actually, to pull this together. So we've been thinking about the way that people went to see shows between about 1800 and 1914.
Okay.
And to begin at the beginning for me, which was actually late,
Yeah.
I became extremely interested in thinking about the way that people who went to films early on, before cinemas even, actually had a means to understand how they worked. In other words, it's perfectly possible to come along to the Bill Douglas Cinema Museum and you can look at the artefacts and you can see them and you can think they're beautiful and pretty, but it's a long sort of shot from there to think about how it was that was received in the first place. What experience was like. You know, what does it mean to go and see a Magic Lantern show? What does it mean to go and see a panorama show? And what does it mean to go and see a cinema show in 1914 at the point when cinemas are starting to come around? So my research, I'm getting around to it, is actually sort of and it is that long-winded, it's an attempt to try to understand what it meant for somebody, say in 1914, but equally in 1820 or 1860 or 1880, to go to a show and to understand it and to explain it to their friends and to, what sort of audiences they were, what it meant to be amazed and surprised by spectacle on the screen, what it meant to be told a story in all those sorts of contexts. And I find lots and lots of interest in that because for me, it changes completely how I understand cinema, which was my beginning point. So that's as broad a kind of set of brushstrokes as I can give you, but it is a big kind of
big topic. You were saying that one of the things that you'll study a lot is Magic Lantern slides, and the item history that we were talking about is a Magic Lantern slide. So in what context would someone see or view a Magic Lantern slide in that early cinema context?
It's actually, this is going to keep happening because these questions are they're actually very big questions.
Yeah.
But in the context of looking at a single lantern slide, you can think that this is a small artifact, but it sort of opens the route for me it's a sort of a raw road towards an entire missing history. So I won't go into great detail, but, from the 17th century, Magic Lantern slides are in existence. In the 19th century, really from the 1840s onwards, they were quite common to see Magic Lantern shows. And in the real heyday, between about, I would say, 1885 and about 1914, they were more prevalent probably than cinema. Was to become, in the sense that they were everywhere. Magic Lantern shows. They would take place in schoolrooms, they would take place in churches, they would take place in public halls and exhibition spaces. They could be held within the family, like amateur films, see later on, exactly. They were used by children in their playrooms, but equally they could be used in the very biggest, grandest exhibition spaces that the country And actually many countries across the world had to offer. This was international too. So you might find magic lantern slides being used by, big famous names. People like Winston Churchill in the 1900s used magic lantern slides in order to tour the country and to talk about things like, his politics at the time when that was really, really important to him. But that, pretty much anybody who wanted to make their points would use magic lantern slides as a means of illustrating what it was that they were doing at that point. And this persists and it goes on. And so when I say that it's pervasive, we think about, certainly in terms of early in studio cinema, we think about that period in the 1920s, and sometimes thought of as a golden age, where you have those wonderful statistics which talk about in America or in Western Europe the way in which actually people in cities were going to the cinema several times a week, in advance of TV, in advance of radio, that kind of medium moment which felt like a kind of a golden age, just because of numbers, right? And that was also true earlier, but for the magic lantern. Right. And it wasn't because they were going to one venue to see things which were arriving, like in the cinema. It was because magic lanterns were being used all the time by almost anybody in order to put across certain points. And so when we see these slides, and sometimes they exist in museums in the hundreds of thousands, it's because actually that's an entire lost practice. It's an entire history of its own, which for me is just about as detailed, and it lasts even longer than the cinemas kind of reached us. And yet it's sort of missing from standard history.
It is. I'm so surprised. Because even in older films that I've watched, you don't ever see them showing things about magic lantern slides. So the fact you said everyone could use it, even like Winston Churchill, for fact or fiction is really surprising me.
Famously Winston Churchill escaped. He was in the Boer War. And famously he escaped from captors, and it was a really big kind of newspaper story. I forget the year. I think it was 1899 to 1901. I think it was 1901, but I'm not sure. And the first thing that happened upon return, more or less, was that he was sought after by all the lecture agents to give a show about it.
It's like weirdly an early form of PowerPoint, if that makes sense. I guess it's the equivalent of what we would have as like a PowerPoint presentation.
But that's exactly it. Yeah. That's exactly what it is. It's the thing where you have, it's an entire sort of medium which, regardless of the technology you're using, it's a combination of a still image accompanied by speech of some sort. Sometimes they tell stories. Sometimes they're short, sometimes they're long, sometimes they tell jokes, sometimes they're about what I did last summer. And sometimes they're about how I escaped from my enemies during the course of warfare in a completely sort of intriguing way. And he was offered tens of thousands of dollars to do the same in America by a lecture agent there, a guy called Major Pond, who was the big lecture agent in America, who wanted lantern shows to be given across North America. And being Winston Churchill, he went across and he made some money, and then he decided he was a bit sick of it after about 6 weeks. So this is too much, this isn't what I want, and he just left again. So
was it more prevalent in the UK than it would be in other countries then, particularly?
Not particularly, no. Okay. And actually that's a big unknown to a large extent. And it's one of those things that makes this such an unknown territory, because whereas we know a fair bit about things in the UK, and we know a fair bit about things in the US and across Europe, partly we know a little bit about the rest of the world because people toured all over the place for all sorts of reasons. And that varied from, big name speakers who want to make a living out of doing lecture tours, and they would tour across the world. So they would do sort of global tours which would encapsulate in the Anglophone world Australia and America and New Zealand and Ceylon and other parts of the colonial empire. Fully colonial in their content too, a lot of these things as well. We don't actually know what the prevalence really was comparatively. What we do know, though, is that they're absolutely everywhere across the States, which has the biggest lecture circuit anywhere, and also the biggest educational sort of market emerging in the late 19th century. And we know they're absolutely everywhere across Western Europe and across Britain as well. But there's so much more work to be done.
Figuring that out.
Figuring those things out.
Absolutely.
You asked me, in what sort of context would we see a slide like the one which you provided for me? And as I said, there are hundreds and thousands of these things. You might see these in almost any context, is the point. Right? So during that sort of golden age, if you were going to a particular church service, whether you were an evangelical or if you were in the C of E, there were sort of entire little genres dedicated to those areas, which allowed you to maybe sing a hymn based on the sort of the prompts which were given on a magic lantern slide, or maybe depicted a biblical story, Or maybe if you were temperance-based
Yeah.
in your thinking, there was a huge amount of kind of temperance propaganda which circulated in this way as well.
Oh, right.
So you might encounter it in that sort of a way as well. If you were giving shows to children, there would usually be a magic lantern component because they were seen as being hugely entertaining. That carried on until I found people talking about the shows they went to when they were kids. This was in Sidmouth. I talked to an intriguing group of old ladies who remembered that they were still giving Christmas magic lantern shows in the 1960s.
Oh,
Oh
wow.
my
Oh,
gosh.
goodness. Okay, yeah.
And so these things sort of persist in all
Yeah.
sorts of interesting
wow.
ways. The slides you've given me it's a picture,
Yeah.
and it is a quite regularly produced sort of slide from the teens in particular. And there's this sort of long-standing relationship between the cinema and magic lanterns, and it begins very early because
Yeah.
sometimes shows do both things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you would.
Yeah, of
People
course.
know magic
Makes
lantern
sense.
Fair
shows,
enough.
and so sometimes they might do a magic lantern show, and what you do is you would introduce a film somewhere because it was fun.
Right, okay.
Often they did like a lecture. They'd tell a story which entertained people, and it allowed you to, the spectacle voice, telling a story. That's
Yeah.
where people went, right? And at the end, there might be a surprise, a spectacle.
Yeah.
And that might be an early film of some sort as well.
Oh,
So
wow.
there's all sorts of different flavours of combinations like that. By the time this slide comes around, this is when cinemas have appeared. So
Yeah.
much more like the sort of cinemas we recognise.
Yeah.
Films appearing distributed centrally,
Yeah.
feels less ad hoc. You go to the same venue time and time again. And yet magic lantern slides, they retain their place again into the 60s and 70s in this country because in between films, on a full programme, you'd expect some sort of content.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And magic lanterns allow you to do that quite easily. And in this case, this is advertising a future film. It's a kind of a trailer, I think.
Yeah.
So it features a comedian who I know as a variety theatre performer. That is, he'd be working in music halls across Britain, and he appeared in the very earliest films, Harry Tate, because he was famous on the music hall.
Oh, right, okay.
So Harry Tate appeared in several early films, some of which survive, before 1910. And the reason he appears in those films is because people knew him.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Just
But
like
you would
today.
never get a chance to see him unless he
Yeah.
happened to be touring in your area until
No,
early
until
films
early
arrived. So it's an
films,
obvious thing that might happen, right?
Yeah.
This is a much later magic landslide, but it's advertising a film to come up, and it would almost certainly take place between the items on a full programme in a cinema.
Oh, wow.
Probably one of several, and probably interspersed as well by just plain old advertising
Yeah.
of the kind which you'd still expect to see in cinemas, right?
Yeah.
You were saying it looks like an early trailer.
Yeah,
Kind of like an
early
early
trailer.
trailer. Like for a film.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. Okay, so we were speaking about sort of acting style in silent film, and we noticed that the style in silent film looks quite different to acting when sound comes to cinema. And so what did it kind of take to be a silent film star, and how exactly did the acting differ from silent film to sound?
It's occupied an awful lot of thinking across the last 20 or 30 years, this question.
Yeah.
And it's partly because you're absolutely right. There is a clear and immediate difference. And
Yeah.
anybody who watches silent film kind of gets that quite quickly. But it's not always, when you interrogate it, quite the same thing. So there's an old version of this argument which says something like, the issue with silent film is because they don't have sound.
Yeah,
no,
that's
and,
what
you
we
know,
thought, yeah.
And it's not wrong. Because they don't have sound, it's necessary to convey thoughts in the word is telegraphed way.
Yeah.
That is, the gestures become more elaborate, the facial expressions become more dramatic,
Yeah.
the makeup becomes more demonstrative.
Yeah.
In the
Yeah.
case of females in particular, but also males. And, there are famously anecdotes about the way that makeup, when it's fully developed in the 1920s, begins to become quite extraordinary on set.
Yeah.
Because by painting a face, a colour which appears bizarre in real life, it appears very natural and expressive
Yeah.
in monochrome.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So there's lots of things around that. You can go and find acting guides which would support that thinking.
Yeah.
So within the Bill Douglas Cinema Museum, there's a number of sort of performance guides and handbooks how to act for the screen, basically, which follow up on decades of work on how to act in the theatre, but which play on the notion of firstly facial expression, second do what you're told. And they all do that in various ways because they're trying to help people to segue into what is a new market for what is actually quite a challenging career even then, right? Being an actor. And while that plays into the idea that there is a big difference, and I agree with it, between silent film acting and sound film acting, that's the case because at that transition point, so many people sort of fall away.
Yeah, that's why you think it, Yeah,
it's not just a myth. It is, although that's mythologized quite popularly in the movies itself.
Singing in the Rain,
Singing in the Rain, love Singing in the Rain. That is also partly true. That's certainly the case. However, and this is the sort of the way that thinking has gone a little bit, which is that while there are differences between early and later, it's not one thing.
Okay.
So, looked at in the round, silent cinema, certainly by the 1920s, and I would argue much earlier than that, from the beginning really, incorporates a lot of different genres.
Right.
It incorporates an awful lot of different acting styles. And all those things change in the context of the arrival of sound. So actually, what I would want to argue is that whereas it's quite tempting because this is the way we think about a movement from an early period to a later period in terms of evolution towards something like perfection.
Yeah.
We just think that way.
That's
so
true.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah.
But I would argue that evolution is a good idea to think about, but in this case, within a few years, people evolve into their environment in such a way that it makes perfect sense for where they are at that time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So my thinking about it is that actually what's happening is that you have people who work in a particular genre or who develop their own, and who therefore kind of are innovating styles which work perfectly in their own environments, and that can be really, really varied. So to be less abstract, if you would think about the obvious case studies for many people when they talk about acting in the 1920s, they think about the big slapstick stars quite often, quite rightly because they're quite brilliant.
Yeah.
Right? So you have somebody like Chaplin who's developed a style. You have somebody someone like Keaton whose style he's again, a celebrated performer of certain kinds of slapstick, but he's very, very different in his performance style from Chaplin. Chaplin is often celebrated, and you watch his films and you think, just how expressive is this face?
Yeah.
So expressive.
It's incredibly formally simple, slightly clown-like, but it's characterized by sort of a few wrinkles around the eyes and the mouth and the moustache as well, which is used to huge effect in order to convey certain points quite clearly, right? So his acting style is really quite subtle, sophisticated, and often famously really moving.
Absolutely.
People who like Chaplin, and not everybody does, but people like Chaplin will realize, this. He's a master of weepy movies as well as comedy.
Yeah.
And then you've got somebody like Keaton, the great stone face, whose face barely moves. Right? It's not that he's not involved in emotion or other things, but his appeal is completely different. And that's within what we would even now think about being as the same genre.
Yeah.
So actually, when you're talking about a transition from that sort of style to a spoken style, Chaplin manages that transition very carefully by not really making it. And Keaton doesn't at all. But there are different solutions, right? So in other words, the changes are really different from one position to another.
Right.
And then less known stars now, people who haven't carried across, people like Harry Langdon, who you may not know. Harry Langdon was about as famous as Chaplin in 1927.
Oh, wow.
And his whole performance regime was, he was really, he made about 3 unbelievably popular movies, and then he slowly faded and within the sound period, but he was still around. Yeah. Langdon is often thought of as playing with the idea of childishness. And there are other ways he's described as well. Sometimes people talk about him playing with the idea of being shell-shocked in the wake of the First World War. So he's an interesting kind of performer, and it only kind of makes sense in a specific cultural moment, which doesn't carry through, and it's, again, quite a different thing. So you've got that sort of, let's just call that a constellation of possibilities, all of which are quite different, actually, when you start to look at them. And then you think about the other side. Now, I could easily, we could think about female performers, somebody like Gloria Swanson in the 1920s, who's quite brilliant, probably about the most marketable star there was in about 1926, 1927. Really, really interesting character actor. You could think another person often thought about in terms of acting in the 1920s was Lon Chaney. Lon Chaney, probably most famous for that early version, I think it's 25, of The Phantom of the Opera.
Oh, yes, I've seen that.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But made a number of other really kind of big movies, was a big star in the 1920s. He sort of developed during the late 1910s as a character actor. And he sort of emerged into stardom in the 1920s through things like The Phantom of the Opera and a number of other, and a number of other films as well, which played on the idea of performance, actually. And I mean by that, acting performance. Yeah. This is totally different. Every time he played a role, it was said he would be a completely different person. He was called a man of 1,000 faces because of this, because of this idea that he was able, we would call it maybe actorliness.
Yeah.
Now, the capacity that you give to some actors to perform almost anybody without becoming typecast.
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like Leonardo DiCaprio, perhaps, is like a modern-day version of that.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, people like Leonardo DiCaprio is a really good comparison, actually, because I feel like there are things which go from performance to performance, but that's not how he's marketed. It's not how it comes across.
He's not just one thing.
Right. So Lon Chaney, similarly, is often associated with the sort of the incipient horror genre.
Yeah.
He plays those roles quite often, quite extraordinary, grotesque roles. He does. And there are figures currently who do that too. But his star image, was all about a specific form of screen acting, very distant from the stage. Actually, that was an earlier model. This one is about the development of the Hollywood actor as a serious kind of impersonator.
Right, okay.
All right. So when somebody like Chaney, who died in 1930...
Has to get back to
but when he's picked up later on,
yeah,
he's played later on by James Cagney, actually.
Oh, really?
In a movie. But anyway, when that sort of transition happens, that actorliness sort of survives pretty untainted, I would argue. The sort of the extraordinary and telegraphed tendencies of a figure like the Phantom of the Opera, and the fact that in that case, facial disfigurement plays a part in that role,
absolutely.
right? And that still serves sometimes as a sort of a marker for Oscar quality. That sort of acting, right?
Yeah,
that
that's
sort
true.
of actorliness. You've got a figure who really reaches out to an audience in that sort of a way. And it, for me, remains in place.
Yeah.
That sort of performance, and I don't see a huge difference between some of those forms of acting and what will come later. So that's why I'm being very long-winded, as usual, in an answer to a really simple question, which is a really good one. Because, yes, there's a big difference, but it's not one difference.
No, it's so many things.
There are hundreds of differences, and I find the transition moment to be fascinating for that reason, actually.
I'd agree.
Yeah. So moving on, in a picture girl we found from January 1925, which we discussed during an episode we did on film paratext, actually. But there's an article in that which talks about the business of film stars during the silent era and how often a business acumen or a good business acumen would make or break an actor's success in the industry. How far would you agree with this in its context?
I do agree with it. What I'd note about it is, that was a great article.
It's a brilliant one, isn't it?
It's a really nice article.
And it's written by a woman, which I find really interesting as well.
Which is also really interesting, absolutely. And she often cites women.
Female stars,
in 1925, isn't it? And it's interesting to look at the people she mentions, actually.
It really is.
In answer to your question, yes, I do think that, of course, it's of a huge advantage, still is, right, for an actor to be able to do the things which this writer thinks of as being good business sense. And that does include things like investing. And it includes things like being able to manage your career, particularly. That's my feeling about it, and that's why it's so interesting. That it's a female writer as well, because she focuses on women who are in some way, sometimes she talks about relying on relatives, and sometimes she doesn't. She talks about the idea that it's become possible for people to manage their career in such a way that they see a way forward, right? And in so many ways, Hollywood in the 1920s is not a progressive place.
No.
And I would never want to make that point.
No, not at all.
But I would want to say that you made a brilliant decision by picking that article, an article written by a woman, primarily about women who are managing their own careers in one way or another. And I agree, yes, of course, it's useful for stars to be able to manage their careers, think about what's happening to their money and thinking about their place in the industry. I'd add to it that they often don't have a choice.
Yeah.
And that's true of men and women, and it's more true of women for all sorts of reasons that we know very well.
Yeah.
But it's true for everybody because of the stipulations of contract systems within the studios.
Yeah.
So in some cases, it's simply the case that you play the roles you're given. As you become a bigger star, you may be able to design a contract where you have more choice over what it is that you do. So you're not just doing things which are simply typecast, but you get the opportunity to vary, your casting, so that you can vary your appeal. So if you think back to the example of Lon Chaney, somebody who's working under contract, in a way, you might say that he's typecast into horror type roles, but actually he's typecast into the Man of 1,000 Faces roles.
Yeah.
And that turns out to be a more liberating choice, perhaps, for somebody who sees themselves as a quote serious actor than other people perhaps working in the industry at that time. And I've forgotten the name. I mentioned her earlier on.
Chloé Swanson?
Thank you, yes. Yeah, Swanson was the other person who just sprung to mind because she's in that article, I think.
I think she is, yeah.
I think that's probably why I remembered her. And she's mentioned, as I remember it, as a good example. Right? So this is a professional woman who's risen to the top ranks of the industry, actually. If memory serves, she's working for Paramount, I think, and she's working under a pretty good contract at Paramount. That wasn't always the case. Famously, some stars didn't. But she had worked her way into a good contract, that being part of good business sense by 25. And in 26, I think it was a year later, but it might have been 27, but I think it was 26, she was offered, I think she ran to the end of that contract and was offered a new one, which was huge. Because she really was
big star.
A big star, an almost guaranteed draw. Someone like Paramount did not want to let go of her. And she refused it because she was more interested in the opportunities at United Artists. United Artists being the studio where people like Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, D.W. Griffith, others were sort of at different times, associated with a studio which enabled some of the big star directors and actors to release their own films. Hence the epic shooting length of Chaplin's movies during the 1920s, because he had much more control than he would otherwise have had. So she associated with United Artists, and she set up a series of her own production companies. And quite quickly, although she was, extraordinarily wealthy, had this sort of eminent position in the industry, within a couple of years, she was pretty much broke.
Oh, wow.
She released movies that were flops
That's a shame.
or that were more difficult to sort of work with. So she's a really interesting case study of somebody who, in 1925, is celebrated rightly as being, highly intelligently in charge of her career, is partly making decisions for herself, I think, in the context of a contract, takes the next step and thinks, actually, I'm going to step behind the camera and work in a production role to some extent. Learns after her first movie how difficult that is, teams up with other directors and other producers, and tries to find a way through that way.
Interesting.
So she's a very, very interesting case study of, someone with sharp business acumen in an incredibly competitive and difficult industry where the studios hold most of the keys. Actually, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting.
Yeah, but the article is fabulous.
It is, isn't it? It's brilliant.
It's a really strong piece, which is sort of pointing towards the fact that regardless of that, others made a success of this. Regardless
Very
of things
quickly.
like this, absolutely, that there's a great deal of force.
Absolutely.
There's a great deal of force, and there's a real potency in all sorts of performers taking charge of their careers in one way or another. The fact that she failed elevates to the surface the fact of how important that was in the first place.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Finally, as a final question, what impact do you think the museum has on the life of the university and beyond?
I came here, it was, when was it now? It was nearly 20 years ago. And I was working in the north of England, but I had studied here. During my PhD, I'd come down because it had been pointed out to me as being sort of a real centre of expertise and a real centre for material and knowledge. And I was up in Sheffield at the time, a young PhD student, sort of working my way through this stuff, and I had never encountered either the range of material, which was relevant to me, and I was working on early British cinema at the time, or the expertise, or the ability to access this stuff from other archives. And I still think that's true. In fact, I know it's true because I use it all the time in my work. There's a remarkable collection of material here, and I have to start with that because for me, as a scholar who works on this stuff and working my way back into the 19th century and forward into the 20th century, there's so much here which is about how people experienced the shows, and I'm going to say that to incorporate cinema. There is material here which you won't see anywhere else. It is an enormous collection, and every time I come along, or every time I even search the catalogue, which Lord knows I've looked at enough times, I will find things there which, sometimes I'll stumble across the same artefacts again and again, and then I'll look at them and I'll find more and more. But more often than not, I'll find things which I've never seen before, and not because they are new arrivals, though things are arriving all the time. It's because they've always been there, and just a matter of, if you can't search through the shelves, just looking through the catalogue is sort of enormously important. So in terms of its importance, it is one of, for me, the world collections about early and silent cinema. And I would also argue that it's one of the world collections for ephemera to do with cinema in general. And that's no small thing.
No.
There are very few comparable places I've seen across the world in terms of what it covers, what it has. And I've never encountered such a capacity to make it available, whether you're a student or whether you're a member of the public, that ability to come in and see these things. So these sound like really big things to say, but I really do mean them, actually. And I also mean this because in a way it's a sort of a reflection. I moved here at the point where I was shifting into this, I was working in early cinema and I've stretched. In both directions, but particularly back into the 19th century and also laterally into all sorts of other media as well, to see how historical media work together. And I do it because I did it initially because it was the best way to make sense of what I saw in film. And now I've realised that it's one part of a much bigger set of dimensions, which are around media and shows all working together at around about the same time. And that's what this place is. And I know it's the Bill Douglas Cinema Museum, but it actually covers media in all sorts of completely interesting, fascinating ways. And it's a comparison which is easily made in some ways, but it's still always, I think, true that it's really from the mid-19th century that everybody was surrounded by competing different versions of media happening to them all the time. And the sense that people often have, sometimes of being hurried at the best. And maybe harassed by the different media sources that surround them, whether they're in your pocket or on a TV screen, or you actually actively select to go and see them at a cinema. There's not the same thing, of course, it's completely different. But there's the same model of experience, the same way of thinking about things which happens in the 1880s. And I just think that, if there were one thing I could say about this place, it draws that historical context where everybody was always encountering this stuff. Remember what I said about magic lantern shows?
Pervasive.
You could go from one to another without even noticing. That seems to me to be hugely meaningful for us. For that sense of anxiety and difficulty to have its own history, I think is worth knowing.
Absolutely.
And I think this place does that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much
for joining us.